morning and welcome to Rising. Hope everyone had a good Labor Day weekend. We unfortunately have some somber news to get to. Now, Israel is on even greater edge as its war in Gaza stumbles into the 11th month. There was news over the weekend that the bodies of 6 hostages had been retrieved from tunnels in Gaza, sent the world reeling. The 6 include one American Israeli, Hersh Goldberg Poland, were killed. His mother, who just spoke at the DNC, spoke movingly at his burial.
For 23 years, I was privileged to have the most stunning honor to be Hersh's mama. I'll take it and say thank you. I just wish it had been for longer.
Hundreds of thousands of Israeli protesters spilled into the streets, demanding its leader make a deal to end the war and bring remaining hostages home. But Benjamin Netanyahu remains defiant.
I apologize to you that we have not been able to bring them back alive. We were close, but we were not successful. And I repeat again this evening, Israel will not act as if nothing has happened during this massacre. Hamas will pay a very heavy price for this.
The world is hardening its rhetoric, if not its stance, against Israel's leaders. The UK announced it would stop selling some arms to Israel. President Biden said that Netanyahu was not doing enough, and VP Harris posted this on X. Today, the president and I met with the U.S. hostages deal negotiation team. The murder of Hersh Goldberg Poland and 5 other hostages was a brutal, barbaric act by Hamas terrorists. As the president said, Hamas's leaders will pay for those crimes. It's long past time for a ceasefire and hostage deal. We need to bring the hostages home and end the suffering in Gaza. That was from Kamala Harris. So what do you make of this development, Jessica?
Right. So the amount of people in the streets in Israel blaming Netanyahu essentially for the killing of these hostages. I mean, we now know over 200 days into this war on Gaza that on October 9th and 10th, there was a deal on the table for a ceasefire in exchange for the release of the civilian hostages that Israel neglected. They said, we will, return these hostages to you in exchange that you don't begin this ground invasion into Gaza. And this has been reported in Israeli papers in the Times of Israel. And so the Israeli citizens are not happy with their government. The largest trade union with over 800,000 workers announced a general strike on Monday. This had a ripple effect into other industries where workers did not show up to work. The Ben Gurion airport, the main airport of Israel, was shut down. And we're seeing Israeli police use these kind of militarized police tactics on their own citizens who are protesting in the street. So it's really just a dire situation. The leadership of Israel clearly wants this war to continue when citizens in Gaza definitely, and in Israel, don't. And so what do we do when we have a rogue right-wing leader? The United States has pledged undying support. I think it's time we see a shift. And the UK pulling their support, their weapon shipments to Israel is a huge first step in that. It seems that things are finally going in that direction with the international community, specifically the West at this point.
Yeah. Are they going in that direction, though? We've heard from Biden for so long, that he supports what Israel's doing, that we're going to continue to support it. And he said that this talk that they were close to a hostage deal, that just comes as no comfort to the families and to the outraged people in Israel who are demanding accountability from their government. But whether the U.S. is going to exert, any pressure, or whether this just hardens Netanyahu toward, militaristic response that Joe Biden, and then if it's Kamala Harris in charge, is absolutely going to rubber stamp. Why should we have any indication that it's going to be different than that? They keep saying that they want incompatible things, that they want a ceasefire deal, but that they support Netanyahu's war against Hamas, and Netanyahu takes the position that Hamas must be destroyed and defeated, and because there can't be a lasting peace until then. And so they're at odds. So this is just going to continue indefinitely, as far as I can tell.
Right. The Israeli people want the hostages released. have not gotten that from Netanyahu. And so I think that's first and foremost. As much as they say they don't want Hamas to exist anymore, many of the Israeli people don't agree with Netanyahu's approach to ensuring that happens. Taking a ceasefire deal to bring the hostages home is something that's incredibly popular in the US and in Israel. And so the fact that now we see members of parliament in Spain, we see this decision by the UK, we are seeing, increased support across the West for, not Netanyahu, but what the people of Israel want. They want a ceasefire as well. It's not putting Israel in a particularly safe position to have Netanyahu not only invading the West Bank, but also now starting this conflict on the border of Lebanon, taking airstrikes in Iran and Syria. And Yemen as well. At this point in time, Netanyahu has been responsible for the escalatory steps that have so many people saying this could become a wider war in the Middle East. We have Russia potentially backing Yemen. We have US ships now in the region. This is not something that's good for the Israeli people or the Israeli citizens. And I think it's time that the United States and the West remembers that while they have an ally in Israel, that doesn't mean they have an ally in Netanyahu, because it seems that at this point, he's made it very clear he doesn't have the Israeli citizens' best interests in mind, the hostages' best interests in mind, certainly not the Palestinians' best interests in mind. And he's compromising, future peace, not just in the world, but in the region. And I think we're at the point where the United States has to make that calculation. And it reminds me of the turning point when the United States decided that it was time for apartheid to end in South Africa. And it didn't happen when the international community recognized apartheid was happening, just like the international community has recognized apartheid is happening in Palestine by Israel. That happened for many, many years before the United States decided to come around and say, yes, this is wrong. And that turning point happened when the tide turned in the country, when they were no longer in support of what their government was doing. And that was very clear. Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist watch list for many, many years before that happened. And so now that we're seeing such widespread unrest in Israel, I think now is at the point where the US is finally going to recognize what's going on and take some steps to withdraw support for Netanyahu. What that looks like in the future and who the leader of the country will be is the next big question.
Yeah. I mean, with the very, very unfortunate, very sad deaths of hostages, I mean, Hamas does, if we're being frank and realistic, Hamas loses some leverage every time this happens. And the, willingness of the Israelis, I think, to continue fighting them, it only solidifies, because we shouldn't mistake dissatisfaction with Netanyahu's leadership. Netanyahu obviously presided over this massive security failure. There have been credible allegations that he's, tacitly kind of supported the legitimacy of Hamas all along, because that delegitimizes the argument for Palestinian statehood and independence. The idea that they have a terrorist organization as their leadership helps him maybe make the case that there should not be a two-state solution. So there's a lot of frustration with his leadership, but I wouldn't mistake that necessarily for a desire among the Israeli people to make peace with the terrorist organization that are their neighbors. They wanted the hostages back, and Netanyahu has failed to deliver that. But if all the hostages die, there's less leverage for Israel to come to any sort of agreement with Hamas.
Yeah, I would categorize Netanyahu's actions around the hostages as weaponized incompetence. The security failures we saw on October 7th were shocking because we know that Israel has much better intelligence than honestly any other government in the world. The Mossad trains the CIA. And so this idea that they weren't aware that this attack was happening is something many people have called into question. And then you have the reality that he didn't want to solve this through diplomacy. He didn't want to say there will be no ground operation. Let's bring the hostages home. So why was the next step not a tactical operation, a precise operation to bring the hostages home, which Israel has demonstrated they have the capacity to do? So I think many people recognize that Netanyahu himself has been responsible for escalating the war. The way the ceasefire talks have gone in recent months and days is that you had a leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, killed. You have Israel consistently rejecting the terms of a ceasefire when the United States has urged them to do so, when Palestinians time and again have agreed to a ceasefire. And so we're now at this point where there is one person who's dragging on the conflict, and that's Netanyahu, and was the killing of these hostages, which was very different from what we've seen from Hamas throughout the war, at a time when over 9,000 Palestinians are unlawfully detained by Israel. You have Hamas making the decision to kill the hostages shortly before they were found in the tunnels by the IDF, almost making it, reality. To many people who witnessed this, there's no other world where they didn't know the IDF was about to find them. So they executed these people on purpose. And so that break in their usual protocol with how they've been handling the civilian hostages, I think tells us a lot with how the conflict has been escalated, and that this was very likely a response to Israel's recent actions in months and days, the killing of the leaders, the invasion of the West Bank, and consistently rejecting the ceasefire deals on the table.
Stay tuned. We'll be back with more Rising right after this. Backpage co-founder Michael Lacey was sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $3 million for one money laundering count in a case involving allegations of promoting prostitution through ads on that website, Backpage. Now, federal prosecutors had been seeking a 20-year prison sentence for Lacey. In 2019, the Justice Department announced the seizure and takedown of Backpage.com, charging former owners and executives with facilitating prostitution as well as money laundering and conspiracy. Joining us now to discuss this case is senior editor at Reason Magazine, Elizabeth Nolan Brown, my colleague there. Liz, you've been following this case for a long while, and I want the viewers to understand, because we've covered a lot, especially just in recent days and weeks, of efforts by federal bureaucrats internationally in South America, in Europe, to hamstring X, to hamstring Telegram, the battles on social media sites and their owners because there's some sordid content somewhere accessible on the site. This is actually a really clear case of this happening in the U.S. So tell our viewers what Backpage was and why the owners of the site have been held criminally liable for the speech that appears on it.
Yeah, so I always say that Backpage has been sort of a test case for squelching free speech online. And it was sort of the playbook that they used to figure out how they were later going to go after X, later go after TikTok, later go after all sorts of other companies. Backpage was a classified ad website, much like Craigslist. People could post ads for jobs. They could post ads for couches. There's also a section of the website that was for adult ads. So this was for sex work and legal sex work, things like dominatrixes, things like strippers, things like escorts, which is not illegal. However, sometimes people, would post ads for things that, seemed legal, but were actually then when they would meet up with people, they would engage in prostitution, which is illegal. So that is why the government wanted to shut Backpage down. They said that people were being, engaging in prostitution on there. They said that sometimes people that were minors were being advertised on there or were advertising themselves on there, which would technically be sex trafficking. So they said, instead, even though Backpage was helping the government when this happened, helping them get the people who were actually doing the trafficking, they said that the owners were actually responsible and they wanted to shut it down because they couldn't totally wipe out any sort of bad speech that was on the website.
Yeah, so even in this case, the owners, the founders, the creators of the platform, they did alert law enforcement, as many of these social media companies do. Facebook reports tons of illegal, illicit activity on the platform. But now, but then the government eventually, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this was prosecuted at some stage, early stage, by Kamala Harris, which is why I thought it was worth talking about. She was involved in this and has bragged about this, actually bragged about it at the DNC, this important test case where she brought a legal charge against the owners who even helped report illicit activity, but because there was anything bad on the platform, one of the founders, I believe, he killed himself facing these charges, and the other was sentenced now.
Yes, so that's right. Not only did they report bad activity, but they were actually there's secret government memos that the prosecutors didn't want to get out that actually got out that talk about how Backpage was more responsive than any other website in this sphere at working with the government. They would testify in court when people were being prosecuted. They would do all of these, they would go above and beyond to sort of help put the bad guys in jail. But obviously, this being a giant user-generated website like Facebook, like TikTok, they couldn't always stop anything bad from getting on the website. So that is why people are going after them, including Kamala Harris, who helped arrest them in 2016 when she was AG of California. She arrested them on pimping charges that were twice thrown out of court. But then the federal government went after them for facilitating prostitution and money laundering. And you're right that one of the men who was the founder of Backpage, Jim Larkin, killed himself last summer before the trial began. And the other one, the other founder, Michael Lacey, was just sentenced. The prosecutors were asking for 20 years, but he was sentenced. The judge ruled to 5 years in prison plus a $3 million fine.
Elizabeth, I don't think it's any secret that stuff like this, it's possible, is happening on Twitter. I mean, it has all of the signs. Many people get those weird DMs. How close do you think we are to there being some kind of retaliation against X and Elon Musk for similar charges?
I think that this has definitely been a playbook where it could be used against X and other social media platforms too. I mean, the reason that they went after them was because even though there's no sex trafficking charges against Backpage, in the press, politicians were constantly saying sex trafficking, sex trafficking, sex trafficking. And then last year you saw Facebook and Twitter and other social media companies get hauled before Congress and asked about sex trafficking or asked about other things involving minors. So it's definitely always people using the prospect of minors seeing bad content or being exposed to predators on these sites as a pretense sort of to go after free speech more generally on any of them. And I think it's possible that they could go after X, they could go after Meta, they could go after TikTok, any of these companies.
I wonder if we're about to enter an era of more combative just relations between the CEOs of these companies and the governments. Obviously, Mark Zuckerberg put out a fascinating letter last week saying that he regrets much of the interaction his companies had with the authorities during the pandemic, that they were constantly pushing Facebook social media moderators to take down speech, and that Zuckerberg mostly went along with it, and he now thinks that a lot of that was wrong. A lot of it was wrong having to do with the warnings they got from the FBI about Russian interference, Hunter Biden content. They regret that. Obviously, Elon Musk will have a very combative relationship with the Kamala Harris administration if she does, in fact, win. If Trump wins, he might be in the administration. I don't know. But it looks like the tech giants have had enough of being just accused of these ridiculous things and being asked to violate very fundamental free speech commitments.
Yeah, and you can't blame them. I mean, again, to go back to the Backpage case, some of the evidence that prosecutors have used against them is saying, well, they should have known that prostitution was taking place on the site or that, other bad things were taking place on the site because they reported it to the government. So the very fact that they did what they are, that was the good thing to do, that they did what they were required by law to do, or that they went above and beyond and did what any good person would do and report potential bad behavior to the government, was then later used against them in the court case by saying, well, they reported it, which means they knew that it was happening. So they should have just shut down the whole website. But that was the prosecutor's argument. They should have just shut it all down because they knew, and they knew we knew because they told us. So it's really disincentivizing any of these tech companies to report things to the government because that could later be used against them in court.
So have you, in your research and looking into this story, found any examples of cases where this happened in the physical world? For example, a Walmart parking lot being a hub for prostitution. Just a quick online search pulls up a lot on this. Are there any comparisons you found, not online, of companies or businesses being sued for something similar?
There are actually. There's been a wave of recent lawsuits against hotels that saying that the hotels knew prostitution was taking place in their hotel rooms and didn't stop it. And there's been none of them have been successful yet, but there's been a big push to hold the hotels liable when prostitution happens at them. And I think that we're really seeing, it's an attack on intermediaries, right? Instead of going after the actual people who are breaking the law, or if there's sex trafficking happening, instead of going after the actual traffickers, the people who are committing violence, committing crimes, people want to hold these intermediary spaces, whether that's an online space or that's a physical space like a hotel, accountable. And I don't think that's right. I think that distracts from the actual issue, which is like, we should be going after the people who are committing the crime. We should not be going after these, whether they're online or physical spaces that are just merely conduits to that activity.
Yeah, I keep saying, would Verizon going to get criminally liable if the bank robbers are talking on their cell phones? Is Ford in trouble if the getaway car is a Ford? I mean, at some point, this just gets utterly ridiculous. And we have important...
If someone if a dating site, if someone meets up and there's, God forbid, a sexual assault or something, I mean, like the logical conclusion is holding so many more things accountable for things that they have no control over.
Yeah, which is exactly what many bureaucrats in the federal government want to do, because this is a tool to shut down speech that they don't like. Elizabeth Nolan Brown, thank you so much for joining us. Viewers really should check out her writing at Reason.com for Reason Magazine about this case. It's fascinating and very undercovered. Thanks so much, Liz. Well, Brazil has set its eyes on taking down another one of Elon Musk's companies. This time, the country is going after Musk's satellite internet company, Starlink. Now, the country's telecom regulators threatened to sanction Starlink and said they could revoke its license to operate in Brazil. That came hours after Brazil's Supreme Court upheld a decision to ban Elon Musk's X nationwide after the platform refused to comply with court orders. Justices had previously ordered X to be blocked after the company refused to name a local legal representative as required by law. According to the ruling, X will stay suspended until it complies with court orders and pays outstanding fines that exceed $3 million. Justice Alexandre de Moraes set a daily fine of $8,900 for anyone using a VPN to access X. The judge also issued an order last week freezing Starlink's finances in Brazil and preventing Musk's business from conducting financial transactions in that country. Now, Musk, meanwhile, accuses Brazil's top judge of acting as a, quote, very evil dictator for suspending X. Musk also tweeted, quote, free speech is the bedrock of democracy, and an unelected pseudo-judge in Brazil is destroying it for political purposes. In another tweet, Musk wrote, quote, the oppressive regime in Brazil is so afraid of the people learning the truth that they will bankrupt everyone who tries. In the ruling, one of the panel justices said X, quote, seems to believe it's above the law. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva told reporters that the, quote, world is not obliged to put up with Musk's far-right ideology just because he's rich. So we're continuing to follow developments in Brazil with Elon Musk and his companies. What did you make of this, Jessica?
Well, it sounds like a little bit of the same playbook the United States has always had whenever a multinational corporation wants to do business in a country that doesn't agree with the business practice. And so Elon Musk trying to have X be accessible to the Brazilian people to get his propaganda to them through satellite is crazy to me. This idea that the Brazilian people, if using a device that's not able to be regulated by their government, Elon Musk by satellite could usher in propaganda to them like leaflets falling out of a CIA plane. It's just amazing how, modern technology creates new ways for them to intervene with other countries' election, political process, access to information. It's just crazy that he could give this entire country access to a website that's banned legally by satellite, and potentially the government could have no way of taking that satellite down. It really makes the case for why the Space Force is even a thing, that eventually we're going to be fighting battles in outer space over satellites.
You say it's crazy. I say it's awesome that the government's the Brazilian government's attempts to censor speech, to prevent people from receiving information, can be thwarted by this private internet Starlink system. But I think a lot of this speaks to what Elon Musk and other people like Michael Schellenberger, who we have on the show frequently, have talked about, these efforts, internationally to grapple with companies like X and Starlink and other social media companies and shut down debate and discussion, purge what they say is misinformation, is false speech. I think we have learned here in the U.S. to be very wary of, experts, government elites coming in and trying to decide which speech is, misinformation and which is not. Obviously, there was a lot of erroneous labeling of speech as hateful or misinformation during COVID, during other subjects. That doesn't mean that the criticism is always wrong, or the contrarianism is always correct, but sometimes it is. And the best way to sort it out is to have broad free speech norms and debate. That's something we do broadly have in the U.S. because we have First Amendment protections. In Brazil and in Europe, as the attempts we've seen recently against Telegram, against, again, X by the EU, there's a class of bureaucratic elites in other countries who want to stifle dissent and stifle speech, and they are going to use those countries' more permissive of censorship legal structures to achieve that. This is something that is affecting X, Telegram. It's going to be affected Facebook in other countries. And Mark Zuckerberg obviously recently complaining that the U.S. was a little different during COVID, saying that he was forced to or persuaded to do lots of censorship that he didn't want to do by the U.S. government. But again, these examples from Brazil and other places show how much worse it can be elsewhere.
Yeah, I think the technology is cool. I mean, the fact that we can give people access to internet by satellite is a cool thing. It becomes crazy and a little bit scary when it's a billionaire with a clear agenda trying to push information to people. I mean, that's what X is blocked over. That's what the judge's decision hinged on, is Elon Musk having a website where false information about the election was pushed to the people in an effort, to change the politics of Brazil. The idea that one very wealthy man could have that much power is what makes me say it's crazy and not it's cool. When Ukraine was at war, and Starlink was being used to provide internet access to people experiencing war. That was something that helped people get necessary medications who are suffering from cancer. That's cool. It becomes crazy when it's some rich guy trying to influence a country's politics in the direction of being friendly of American companies' exploitation.
Well, but you say influence I mean, his platform is, it's a free speech platform where people can give information that is true, they can give information that is false, you can decide what you think. I mean, is that really pushing Elon-friendly or right-wing friendly or American-friendly information to just have a platform and say the information is not going to be restricted? I think you could say that the Brazilian authorities are the ones, that this Brazilian judge is pushing one kind of information or the other by saying that this place where information I don't like is accessible, that should be prevented. I think the people on the other side would say, well, that's the pushing a narrative, that's the pushing one's politics. It's being done by the people trying to do the censoring, not the people saying just the site should be open to whoever.
Right. It would be one thing if this was a website where he didn't have an account on it, he didn't push any information on it, he didn't have algorithms that favored right-wing speech or favored misinformation about the recent election in Brazil and pushed that to X users in Brazil. If it was just any information people want access to, the most popularly interacted with accounts are at the top of the feed, and it actually operated as a free speech platform, that would be different, but that's not what they found. They did not find that X is operating that way. And so, yeah, I think that that's a big reason why they're upset about it, is it's not actually a free speech platform. I mean, Elon Musk himself posted over the weekend this quote that it says, people who can't defend themselves physically, women and low testosterone men, parse information through a consensus filter as a safety mechanism. They literally do not ask, is this true? They ask, will others be okay with me thinking this is true? That makes them very malleable to brute force and manufactured consensus. I mean, he's pushing the dehumanization of people who are women and low testosterone as people unable of understanding the truth. That is someone who's not using his free speech platform responsibly. This is a platform where calling someone cisgender is deemed a slur. This is not a free speech platform. It's turned into a platform for him to push his particular political agenda. That's why it's been banned in Brazil.
So you think that what you just read you should be prohibited from posting that on social media, or that a site should be fined or sanctioned if they allow you to post that on the site?
No, I didn't say that. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying this is insight into Elon's political perspective and view of the world. And the type of information he wants to push on his personal platform is a reflection of what the judges have found in Brazil. And it's that he's intentionally pushed misinformation to favor the right wing in Brazil after they just held a democratic election. And so to force this agenda in Latin America, to have the people cast doubt on their electoral process, their democracy, and the majority of what people believe politically in the country, to try and influence that through satellite and through pushing information onto these people, that doesn't sound like free speech to me.
All right, we'll have more Rising right after this. The election fraud case against Donald Trump is dead, according to Syracuse law professor Greg Germain's latest takeaway, after the former president was indicted yet again. Now, for context, prosecutor Jack Smith filed new paperwork to re-indict Trump on 4 felony charges relating to his effort to subvert the 2020 presidential election. Now, given the Supreme Court's July ruling that presidents, current and former, have sweeping immunity, Smith's latest action takes that order into consideration.
But will it work? Germain says no, telling Newsweek recently, quote, "While the lower courts may try to interpret their way around the Supreme Court's decision, ultimately, I think the election interference case is dead before the Supreme Court." Here to discuss further is Gregory Germain, an attorney at law and professor at Syracuse in New York. Welcome, Gregory.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So help us understand why you believe this case is dead at the Supreme Court.
Well, I mean, it's not at the Supreme Court right now. You know, it's back in the trial court, and then it'll go to the D.C. Circuit, both of which ruled in favor of the government. So I think they're going to try very hard to interpret around the Supreme Court's decision. But basically, they said intent doesn't matter. And if intent doesn't matter, the only thing that matters is whether it's plausibly related to his actions as president. I think it's just going to be very, very hard to meet that kind of a test. Now, I'm very critical of the test. I think it was very overbroad and unnecessary. But that's what the Supreme Court said. And so it's just going to be very hard to get around that ruling in connection with an activity that had some relation to his office.
I think a lot of the frustration with the ruling is, of course, that it did not very carefully or at all, to my recollection, define what is an official act of the presidency. It kind of said that, yeah, there's definitely some acts that would be official acts, and there are certainly some that would not be official acts. And we leave it to you to figure it out and bring a case before us that narrowly hinges on that matter, and then maybe we'll describe them more specifically. How does that relate to which charges Jack Smith decided to keep and which he's not proceeding with?
Well, he dropped everything that the Supreme Court kind of directly said you can't charge the president with. And so a charge that he conspired with his advisors, the Supreme Court said, he's allowed to conspire with his advisors. And so he dropped those things and he labeled other activities as private. And so if he met with advisors who weren't government employees, they said he met with private advisors who weren't government employees. So he tried to do his best to identify the things as private activities. But the problem is how broad the ruling is. And I thought the ruling was very wrong in not recognizing that the important distinction between private and public rulings is the president's motive. If he has a corrupt and improper motive, then it should be private activity. If he's doing something that he thinks is best for the country, then it's a government activity. But by eliminating that distinction, I think the court made it virtually impossible when you've got something that is broadly related to being president, involving an election, to successfully argue that it's private activity. On the other hand, the other case, which is which was dismissed in Florida based on the prosecutor's appointment, involving the documents case, I think that's going to clearly be private activity because it was after he was in office and had nothing to do with his governmental function. But I think the election interference case is going to be very hard to, dance around the limits that the Supreme Court put on the case.
Can you help us understand that distinction you just made between, was it official acts or not, whether or not the best interest of the country was at heart when the decision was put forth versus not? And if not, then it was a private decision. Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, what I said is that I thought motive is the key distinction. So was Trump motivated by what he believed was in the best interest of the country, or was he motivated to do something against the best interest of the country that was in his personal interest? And the Supreme Court specifically said motive plays no part in determining whether it's a governmental or private activity. And I thought that was just clearly wrong. And I think it was wrong from a historical point of view, and I think it's wrong from a policy point of view. So historically, the drafters of the Constitution were very concerned about corruption. They put a clause in the contract saying you can't take any gifts, and so the idea that someone with corrupt motives would be able to treat it as a get immunity, I think is completely wrong. And so if the president, for example, sold pardons for money, $100,000, I'll give you a pardon. Something as corrupt as that. I don't think any of the drafters of the Constitution would have said you're immune from prosecution for that. But the Supreme Court said, yes, you're immune from that. If a president for corrupt motives tried to get the SEAL Team 6 to kill a political opponent, that would be his motive would be the problem. And the Supreme Court said, no, we have to hope that the military wouldn't go along with his order, but that would be a governmental function. And so, I mean, I think the ruling was so broad and ignored the most important factor that I just don't see a way around it.
Well, obviously the dissent referenced that specific scenario, the president ordering targeting an assassination or something of a rival. The majority opinion did not specify that type of action would count as an official act at all, right? I mean, that could if that sort of thing happened, do we have any reason to expect the majority wouldn't say, well, that does in fact fall outside the obvious official duties because there isn't a right or an official reason to carry out an action like that?
I think John Roberts' decision did say that that hypothetical would be an official act. That's the problem with the opinion. You're right, of course, that it was a very closely divided Supreme Court, and a change in the Supreme Court might result in reconsideration of this decision. But as it stands now, I just don't see a way around it.
So do you think Trump's team's decision to delay this case as much as possible, seemingly, is so that they can construct an argument? Do you see them cooking something up in defense of Trump, or do you see this more as their intention to delay beyond the election so the election can happen, potentially Trump can be in office, and the hearing will never happen? What do you make of Trump's legal team's position now?
I don't think there's much doubt that this case is going to get delayed until after the election. And certainly then there will be appeals from it. So, nothing's going to happen before the election that's going to decide this case. We're only 2 months away from the election. So they've very successfully delayed all of the federal cases, the cases that were the strongest cases against Trump. And so I think we won't get any kind of real conclusion until after the election. Now, the real question is what happens after the election, and I think if Trump's elected, the cases are gonna die because he's going to cause them to be terminated either by pardoning himself, which the court has suggested a self-pardon is okay because motive doesn't matter and he has absolute pardon power. Or by appointing people to the Justice Department who will dismiss the case. So very much, the case only has a chance of surviving if he isn't elected.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us to discuss. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Shots fired. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posted a fiery video to her Instagram account on Sunday, blasting Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein. Take a look.
And can't pursue any successful strategy, and all you do is show up once every 4 years to speak to people who are justifiably pissed off, but you're just showing up once every 4 years to do that? You're not serious. You're not to me, it does not read as authentic. It reads as predatory.
Congresswoman hit Jill Stein's multiple unsuccessful presidential runs and the struggles to grow the third party, the Green Party, at the grassroots level. Democrats have, in many cases, deemed Jill Stein a spoiler candidate, and including the reason Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump in 2016. A new survey by the Council on American Islamic Relations found that Muslim voters, in particular, evenly split right now between Jill Stein and Kamala Harris, possibly setting up Democrats to make the same argument. But joining us now to discuss is Jill Stein herself, the Green Party candidate. Welcome back to Rising.
Great to be with you, Ravi, Jessica. Good to see you.
Great to see you as well. We really appreciate your time. What did you make of AOC, someone who describes or has been described as a very progressive Democrat, nevertheless attacking the candidate, the most left-leaning candidate in the race?
I think it's pretty funny. Talk about authentic, reclining on her sofa and, providing this very kind of concocted argument. Clearly, she was set up as the attack dog of the day. Clearly, they are very worried because, American voters are in a state of rebellion, and our campaign is the one anti-genocide, anti-war, climate emergency, pro-worker campaign, which is turning out to be on the ballot now across the country. The Democrats have not succeeded in their extremely predatory tactics of silencing political opposition, silencing voters, denying voters the choices that they are clamoring for. She just kind of makes a mockery of the anti-democratic party in pretty much her whole message and the way that it was delivered. So I think she really did us a great favor and only draws more attention to the flailing of the Democratic Party right now, whose base is very much up in arms. And the one other thing I want to add is that if there's anything predatory here, the height of predatory is conducting a genocide and trying to, manipulate voters into thinking that Kamala Harris is working, diligently day and night for a ceasefire. This is absolutely not true. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have the power to shut down this genocide in the blink of an eye, and they are not they are not interested and have said as much. They're not going to do it. And the American voters know that and are in an uprising right now as we speak.
And so there were a few false statements that AOC made. And as someone who grew up working class in the tri-state area, at one point I looked up to AOC. I was a bartender. I used it to pay my bills. Then I found out she had a publishing company while she was a bartender. And then I found out she actually went to high school in Yorktown in northern Westchester County, which is a much better school than the schools they've got in the Bronx. And so listening to her say that the Greens have run you for president over and over consecutively is just flat out wrong, because anyone who pays attention to the Greens would know that in 2020, it was Howie Hawkins who was running at the national level with the Greens, and that not only do you run candidates at the local level, the Greens have candidates in Minnesota and Arkansas and Wisconsin, in a lot of states that we don't see progressive organizations really investing in right now. So can you just speak to a little bit of that attack and how there were inaccuracies in it?
Yes, I mean, that attack was predatory. That attack was entirely false. The Greens have elected some 1,400 candidates over the past 15, 20 years, largely to local office. We have school committee members and, members of boards of selectmen and mayors, in fact. And the Greens are leading the charge in many ways. And it's so funny that she's saying, describing our runs as unsuccessful, yet she ran on our signature issue in a predatory fashion without acknowledging where she got her Green New Deal from. She launched it in 2018. We had launched it in 2010. And, there she was standing there as if she had come up with this, invented it out of whole cloth. So, there's plenty of predatory there. We basically launched the progressive agenda, starting with single payer, which Ralph Nader ran on in 2000 as a Green, calling for free public higher education and a bailout for students in debt, for reparations against, for enslaved people to repay an outstanding debt, a huge debt. All of these things she and much of the Democratic Party have given lip service to, which have really come from the Greens. So we have totally transformed, the political agenda. And when she says we're, ineffective compared to what, given the tactics of largely the Democratic Party to silence political opposition, non-corporate campaigns and parties generally last less than 10 years at a national level. So you can look at, for example, Peace and Freedom Party, which at one point had ballot access across the country, maybe 25, 30 states at one time. They've been knocked back to 2. The socialist parties now run candidates for city council here and there. The Greens have actually been enormously successful compared to all the other non-corporate parties. And one other thing, when she says, that she knows about third parties because she's run with working families. Well, unfortunately, with all due respect, the Working Families Party is not really a third party. They are a second ballot line for Democrats, and they work hand in glove with the Democratic Party. If you claim to be an alternative party, or a third party, you don't know what that means unless you're under attack by the Democrats, because that is basically the major characteristic of running as an alternative, is that you have to put up with the dirty tricks, the fraud, and the abuse committed by the anti-Democratic Party.
Now, Dr. Stein, I like that you pointed out. Sorry, I want to jump in here and make sure we get to this. When you had just pointed out that AOC at the DNC, in her speech, she said that Kamala Harris is working tirelessly for a ceasefire. Ilhan Omar, fellow squad member, hit back. She was at a rally and she said, the way you have a ceasefire is you stop sending the weapons. She can do that today. Just stop sending the weapons. And Palestinian American and representative at the state level in Georgia, Ruwa Roman, was meant to speak at the DNC. The DNC sort of ended this last minute. Everyone was hoping a Palestinian American would speak who's in this movement for peace in Gaza. She posted, real talk, do political operatives know that Arabs show up as white in census data? And also in a lot of campaign data, I share this because in 3 of the top 5 swing state House races in Georgia, Arab voters are anywhere from 1 to 3 times the margin of victory. Georgia's a key state for the Democrats. And not that Arabs and Muslims are all the same, but there is overlap. Seeing that you're polling, getting half of the Muslim vote compared to Kamala Harris getting the other half, how does that make you feel? It seems that there are a lot of these voters that really see you as the candidate that recognizes the situation in Gaza at this pivotal moment.
Well, I have to say that the genocide in Gaza has really been a central issue from us from the very start, and we had a candidate, you may recall, Cornel West was going to be the candidate for the Green Party. And when he parted ways, for totally understandable reasons, it's hard to join a party for the first time when you're running as its presidential candidate, so that, be that as it may, when he parted ways, we had very little time. And I was compelled and arm twisted to jump into the race very much because we had ballot lines and we knew that we could provide an alternative, a place for Americans who, by huge numbers, not only oppose the genocide, but support a weapons boycott in order to achieve that ceasefire and put an end to this horror, this daily massacre that we witness. So the genocide was very much a motivator for me to jump into the race and to be sure that our ballot lines would not go to waste, because there are other progressive, wonderful voices out there, but they don't have the ballot lines in order to truly challenge empire and to challenge genocide. So, I take it very much as a Jew who grew up after the Holocaust, shortly after the Second World War, in a Jewish synagogue. For me, it was really essential in coming to terms with genocide to affirm, to absolutely, incorporate into my DNA as a human being that genocide won't happen again. We won't let that happen. And that means not perpetrate genocide and not be a bystander to genocide. And right now, our country is doing both. We are a perpetrator and we are a bystander. And I think it's so critical. It really is a moral imperative of the moment that we not be talked into holding our noses and voting on behalf of genocide. And I'm so, really grateful to the Arab American and the Muslim communities who are living this, up close and personal, who are taking the genocide, really within their own families, that they are increasingly discovering and supporting our campaign. And I think all bets are off about where this goes. And it's really important. The genocide is not just a crisis of this moment. It really is a crisis of empire and the state of American foreign policy, which needs to change. It absolutely must change. And we pay a devastating price for that here at home in terms of, half of our congressional budget, so that we can't pay for the healthcare and the housing and the education and the climate action that we urgently need. So I really see it as a central and very unifying issue. And I'm really gratified that so much of America is discovering that we actually are the alternative that they have been clamoring for.
Just very quickly, because we're running out of time here, you've used the phrase anti-democratic party a couple times. We've reported on this show of, for instance, efforts the Democratic Party made to, recruit activists to try to disqualify RFK Jr. from the ballot. Consequently, he's no longer in the race and has endorsed Donald Trump. I think there's something, there's a be careful, of getting what you wish for, just in terms of the politics and the tactics of what the Democratic Party did. But obviously it goes beyond that, because it's in their name. And is what Kamala Harris and Joe Biden before her made the most fundamental issue of this election, is the preservation of democracy itself. So what does it say when they take actual efforts to disqualify rival candidates and then rhetorically, like AOC does, try to say that, well, third parties, they're not viable, you have to stick with the Democrats? Well, if they're not viable, why aren't they viable? Because you're part of a two-party system that helps to keep it not viable.
Exactly. And, the most disastrous election outcome that they've had in modern times is the 2010 election, where they lost 1,000 seats in state legislatures, 64 in Congress, some 13 in the Senate, and the same number of governor seats, not because of a third party, but because they had just bailed out Wall Street to the tune of trillions while throwing out millions upon millions of homeowners from their homes. And before that, it was NAFTA and the Clintons, so the Democrats have lost their own base, and their effort to silence competition, is outrageous. And they not only, hired an army of lawyers to throw us off the ballot, and they challenged us in 3 states, but we've beaten them back. I think we're going to prevail in all 3 states. They publicly advertised for infiltrators and spies to disrupt our party and our projects, getting on the ballot. And they also hung on to our public matching funds and basically hijacked that money also to keep us off the ballot. So, the Democrats have really made a mockery out of themselves. They are not the servants of democracy. And when they rail about Donald Trump as the essence of fascism, we don't have to wait for Donald Trump. We're seeing fascism right now roll out in our communities, with cop cities and police that are being trained by the Israeli Defense Forces, who are cracking the heads of anti-war, anti-genocide protesters who are just expressing what the American people themselves feel. So I think the Democrats continue to marginalize themselves. Before AOC, it was actually Jamie Harrison who tried to smear us on social media and made an utter fool of himself in doing so. So I say, bring it on. Keep throwing us into the briar patch, because, it speaks volumes, and, it really helps the American people understand what the nature of their choices are right now.
Well said, Dr. Stein. Appreciate you sharing your perspective on all of this. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much. Oh, and if I can add, it's jillstein2024.com. And I encourage people to come and join the team because it's definitely not over and you don't need to drink the Kool-Aid. Thanks so much.
Trump has really changed up his tune when it comes to women and abortion. I wonder why. Maybe it's because the new Reuters Ipsos poll shows Harris with a growing lead among women. The latest poll shows Harris leading Trump 49 to 36% by 13 points. As a reminder, it wasn't long ago Trump was talking about abortion like this. Let's watch.
Do you believe in punishment for abortion? Yes or no, as a principle?
The answer is that there has to be some form of punishment.
For the woman?
Yeah, there has to be some form.
He's also known to brag about the overturning of Roe versus Wade.
For 54 years, they were trying to get Roe v. Wade terminated, and I did it. And I'm proud to have done it.
So it makes sense for Americans to do a double take when they heard Trump say this about IVF.
IVF has been an issue that has become political. Yeah. A lot of people talking about it. What's the Trump administration going to do when it comes to IVF if you get elected?
Right. Well, as you know, I was always for IVF right from the beginning. As soon as we heard about it, it's fertilization and it's helping women and men and families. But it's helping women able to have a baby. Some have great difficulty, and a lot of them have been very happy with the results, as you know. And what we're doing, and we're doing this because we just think it's great, and we need great children, beautiful children in our country. We actually need them. And we are going to be, under the Trump administration, we are going to be paying for that treatment. So we are paying for that treatment.
All Americans who want it?
For all Americans that get it, all Americans that need it. So we're going to be paying for that treatment. Or we're going to be mandating that the insurance company pay.
Meanwhile, Trump's running mate J.D. Vance was pressed by CNN's John Berman on Trump's inconsistent abortion stance. Let's watch.
You say he's been consistent, but of course there was a period in Donald Trump's life where he was not anti-abortion. Then he became anti-abortion, at one point suggesting that women should be punished if they have an abortion. Now he's saying he's for more than 6 weeks, but it's not clear how he's going to vote in an amendment in his own state. So that's why I think people are seeking clarity. You can understand that.
Well, John, the Dobbs decision, what it fundamentally did is this goes back to Democratic legislatures and the people, of course, who elect those legislatures. I think the president has said in a post-Roe, a post-Dobbs world, he wants voters to make these decisions. I think it's important to remember, of course, that Kamala Harris has come out for taxpayer-funded abortion.
Sorry, Senator, but he's a voter in this case. The reason it matters, in Florida is he's a voter. Go ahead.
Well, of course it matters what his position is, and I'm sure that he's going to say what his position ultimately is, John.
You say he's been consistent, but of course there was a period in Donald Trump's life where he was not anti-abortion. Then he became anti-abortion, at one point suggesting that women should be punished if they have an abortion. Now he's saying he's for more than 6 weeks, but it's not clear how he's going to vote in an amendment in his own state. So that's why I think people are seeking clarity. You can understand that.
Well, John, the Dobbs decision, what it fundamentally did is this goes back to Democratic legislatures and the people, of course, who elect those legislatures. I think the president has said in a post-Roe, a post-Dobbs world, he wants voters to make these decisions. I think it's important to remember, of course, that Kamala Harris has come out for taxpayer-funded abortion.
Sorry, Senator, but he's a voter in this case. The reason it matters, in Florida is he's a voter. Go ahead.
Well, of course it matters what his position is, and I'm sure that he's going to say what his position ultimately is, John.
In another push to appeal to women voters, Trump is scheduled to be a keynote speaker at the 3rd annual Moms for Liberty Summit. The group is a national nonprofit that has spearheaded efforts to get LGBTQ+ and structural racism content out of K through 12 classrooms. So we'll see if that's enough to woo the women. But I do think Trump is the kind of guy who's a true populist who sees that something he's pushed is something that could threaten his election efforts because it's unpopular. And he's like, well, I changed my mind on it. It makes it really hard for someone like J.D. Vance, who hasn't been like that as much as Trump has, flippant on the issues from one interview to the next, to have to answer for Trump. J.D. Vance is in a tough position.
Well, I mean, Trump has changed his mind over time. He was a former Democrat, obviously, but I don't see. Well, I mean, he's he is not running on abortion restrictions at the national level. I agree that Dobbs was about turning the decision back to the state. That's populism. That's letting the people decide. And in state after state, the people have decided that they don't want very strict restrictions on abortion. Maybe some restrictions would be fine. Donald Trump himself said restrictions coming in at 6 weeks was far too early. You know, European nations, many of them, like France, have restrictions getting in at 12, 14 weeks, that range. If that's what people decide in the states, that seems perfectly reasonable to me. If different states put it earlier or later, they can do that, and you have to make the argument. But in terms of a federal policy, he's been very clear that there shouldn't be one. And yeah, he's talking about all sorts of, some socially liberal ideas that I actually like him coming out and saying marijuana should be decriminalized. Not that you should, be smoking it in the streets because the smell bothers a lot of people, but that, in your house, private marijuana use should just absolutely not be a crime at all. That was very nice to hear from the president. And, he's coming out in support of things like IVF at a time where Tim Walz was trying to confuse everyone into thinking that he had gone through it when he'd gone through a completely different proceeding. Now, I don't know that I'm not for government subsidizing things, but I'm certainly for having those things be options for families and getting regulatory hurdles out of the way for people to, plan their own families and all that kind of stuff. That's what Trump's running on. So this idea that he can be tarred as some kind of abortion extremist is, I think, just not going to work.
Well, I don't think it's extremist what Tim Walz has done by, it's IUF, not IVF. He calls it IVF because colloquially that's the term that's used. This is something that Democrats have vowed to protect for a long time. Trump coming out and saying everyone's going to get free IVF. I'd like to know how. It seems good to want to give Americans health care like every other modern nation does, but that's not something Trump wants to do. So is it just IVF that he's offering to people? Some Republicans, there are 2 Republicans in Congress that have already split from Trump over this. And then you have Tom Cotton saying, we're open to Trump's IVF proposal. This kind of, populist right that's fueled by a lot of evangelical Christians who don't see IVF as something that is good. A lot of Catholics as well. They see this as something that is killing embryos, which they believe have a right to life, by fertilizing eggs and then discarding them if they're not selected as the eggs that will be implanted in a uterus, that is an illegal abortion in some states. And so this is going to be an issue that I think divides Republicans because they've put themselves in a position of saying, we don't want abortion. Many states have a 6-week ban. And there's no exceptions for rape or incest in many of these states. And that's not been popular among women. So Trump immediately changing his position, he doesn't have the party in lockstep coming with him, because a lot of the party are those state representatives and those Congress people that have advocated for those early bans that are incredibly unpopular. And so they've really have dug themselves into quite a ditch here with this issue that I think Trump can climb out of, but he might leave a lot of the Republican Party and some of his voting base behind.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this. Has journalist Olivia Nuzzi been canceled for criticizing President Joe Biden? So the PR for the New York Magazine reporter's new show with Bloomberg was allegedly canceled over her criticism of Joe Biden in an article that she wrote in July, a great article that we discussed on the show, called "The Conspiracy of Silence to Protect Joe Biden." Now, according to Semaphore reporter Ben Smith, Democrats online killed the flashy rollout of Nuzzi's new show, persuaded her employers not to promote it, it's called Working Capital, by waging a campaign to get her in trouble for past statements.
Now, he said, quote, "The interview show announced with great fanfare in July wound up being unceremoniously released on Bloomberg's television network and is available online." Nuzzi confirms that plans for a higher profile rollout of the Bloomberg Originals bet were abruptly scotched after a Nuzzi article about the conspiracy of silence around Joe Biden's age.
Now, Democrats on X called her racist and demanded that she be fired from Bloomberg. Many of these claims based on tweets she sent during the Obama years back in 2014 that were obviously jokes. aimed at people who didn't like Obama. She had tweeted, "Kenyan anti-colonial shows teeth to small child, happy Pi Day." That's making fun of the criticism of Obama from racists, not an endorsement of the racist criticism. Olivia Nuzzi, whom I know socially a little bit, is a, liberal mainstream reporter, but who does criticize both sides and does good reporting on the Democratic Party as well as Trump, and had produced that really great piece about how Joe Biden's inner circle absolutely knew he was in decline and absolutely hid that fact from the American people and persuaded gullible friends in media that everything was fine. It was an important, great work of journalism that criticized, the media's own side, the Democrats, whatever. And in response, pro-Biden people tried to get her in trouble. They didn't get her fired, but they got her employer to kind of, instead of doing a major promotion for the show, just sort of like drop the show, unannounced, to totally change tactics, because she dared report. She did the thing journalists are supposed to be doing, right? Calling truth to power. That sort of whole thing. Nope, that's only if you're being critical of Republicans, of Trump, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know much about, it's Nuzzi, isn't it? I'm saying Nuzzi, that's not right.
Olivia Nuzzi.
My Italian ancestors are upset, Robbie.
Yes.
But no, I think it's something that happens in media. I would agree that it makes sense. The article is the reason this happened. They don't change up their strategy for no reason at all. You'd be surprised what happens in backroom conversations, and making people a little bit upset by expressing views that maybe have nothing to do with what the show is covering is absolutely a reason some executive at Bloomberg was upset and directed them to remove some of the marketing resources that were allocated towards the show elsewhere. And then they say, "Oh, looks like no one wants to watch your show. We're going to cancel it." It happens, I'm sure, all of the time. I mean, just my small career in media has taught me that a lot of decisions are made because of the personal preference of someone in a position of power. And if Olivia Nuzzi is not doing a good job, being a darling of the establishment, she'll quickly realize what that means for a journalist's career. I mean, that's why you see so many people getting their news from alternate outlets, from independent media, from people who have ideas and cover stories outside of the mainstream, because it gets kind of boring. And so I think it's a losing media strategy on top of being a very common one that Bloomberg did this.
Yeah, I wanted to read what Olivia Nuzzi herself said about the situation. So she wrote this, or she said this: "When I write something that agitates the right, I am accused of being a liberal activist. When I write something that agitates the left, I'm accused of being a conservative activist. The difference is that mainstream media organizations tend to ignore bad faith campaigns against reporters led by the right," she observed. "I have no illusions about massive corporate media entities and their tolerance for even the faintest murmurs of a PR crisis, so I can't say I was surprised, but I was disappointed. I really believe that if you want to live in a world which is forgiving and where people hold even those they disagree with to the same standards they wish to be held, you can't cave to mob pressure as a means to protect yourself, even when it would be a lot easier to do. That's how this type of culture is formed and maintained. As individuals, we get to decide if we think it's worth enduring a little pain to fight against it." So she is not happy about this decision, and she shouldn't be. This is absolutely payback for shining a light on the nefarious behavior of Biden's inner circle, trying to, lie to the American people. Karine Jean-Pierre working tirelessly to convince you that if you were worried about the president, the candidate, Joe Biden, in those videos that showed him, kind of disoriented and not knowing where he was going, that you were imagining that was part of manipulated videos, and everything was fine. Everything was all fine up until the moment at the debate when it was undeniable that something rather curious had happened with Joe Biden, maybe in recent months and weeks, maybe for longer, who knows, but that he was not capable of running for president, maybe not capable of serving as president, even though he continues to do so.
Yeah, I think that period of history, we're going to look back on and laugh. I mean, those press conferences, it's her job. It's Karine Jean-Pierre's job to defend the administration. That is what she signed up for. One of the worst jobs in American politics is to be the spokesperson of really any division of government. I've said this before, but I think people are coming around and realizing just how bad the revolving door between the establishment and media really is. I saw trending on Twitter, finally, people who have realized who Oliver North really is, someone who was caught in the Iran-Contra scandal, illegally selling U.S. missiles to Iran, now on Fox News commentating on precisely how Iran should not have any access to missiles. And so people are realizing that these same guys go on as military analysts on mainstream news networks to say precisely whatever the establishment wants them to say with no logical consistency whatsoever. It's just the poison of our politics today. You can go on and say, you know, I'm against an income tax. I think that instead we should have a property and wealth tax. And even the most progressives, most people who are most progressive on the left side of the political spectrum will look at that and say, well, we can't get rid of the income tax, and not put any thought into it and just have a knee-jerk reaction to these policies. And we're just at a point where if something sounds different from what the people in someone's political camp think, they have this visceral reaction to defend it despite not really understanding it. And I think that's what's got to change. And so even, you know, the establishment people are victims to it. So maybe now that people who are more establishment journalists, Robbie, are seeing that this is a problem, maybe now finally we'll see some change.
Yeah. It's just amazing to me because the media does complain when, you know, when right-wing people bring up past tweets or something from mainstream or progressive people, then it's, oh, this, you know, how dare they're sicking harassment on this is a right-wing harassment campaign, which again I think is bad. But then when the Democratic Party does it, it gets, you know, little attention. Is not usually necessarily called out, but very good for Semaphore for doing that. I saw Mediaite also covered it, and of course we're covering it here. That does it for us today on Rising. Great having you with us, Jessica. Where are you in the world right now?
I'm in Iowa, sunny Iowa, the beautiful Midwest.
Well, we said farewell to Brat Summer. I think there was an official declaration from what is her name? Help me out.
Charlie XCX.
That's it.
But we're celebrating sweet corn season here in the Midwest. It's a little bit good to be outside of the swamp in DC. I was getting bit by mosquitoes in the middle of the day in downtown.
Can't have that. Well, we would hope to lure you back to the district sometime soon. In the meanwhile, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you can find podcasts, and we will see you tomorrow.
Bye, y'all.